So we recently purchased an Olympian Wave 3 heater for our motorhome, but the heater is dust sensitive. So I'm going to sew a cover for the heater, and I thought that other people might be interested in following along and sewing a cover for their own Olympian heater as well. This is the Wave 3 heater that I have. There's an older model of the Wave 3 that has a slightly different shape. I'm not sure if this cover will fit those older units, so be sure to check which version of the Wave 3 you have before you make this cover. If you click the link in the description box below, you can find the written instructions for this pattern on our website. For the materials, you're going to need a 18 by 28 inch piece of fabric, a 2 3/4 inch square of that same fabric, matching thread, and some Velcro. If you're using a fabric like mine that has a rubberized backing, I would also recommend having some tracing paper and a Teflon foot, which I'll explain later. I just want to mention that the fabric that I'm using is a poly canvas with a rubberized backing. And this is great because it's going to create a complete seal for the cover, and it won't allow any dust through. On the downside, it is a little more difficult to work with. It's sticky in the machine and it's a bit thick. Ideally, I would recommend using a densely woven nylon, like something that would be good for outdoor gear. But this was just what was available at the Walmart near where we're camping, so this is what I'm using. So start by taking your large piece of fabric, which is going to be the main body of the cover, and fold it in half lengthwise and get a really good crease here because it's important. So make sure these edges are all matched and that you've got exactly at the halfway mark. I didn't use an iron, I just finger pressed this because my fabric has a rubberized backing, but if your fabric can take an iron a crease in, that'd be great. So now we have our fabric and I'm going to place it right side up, and I'm going to mark 3 inches on this corner. So this is facing me, the right side of the fabric, right side up, and on this right edge, lengthwise, I am going to mark 3 inches from this corner. Just using my chalk, and I marked 3 inches. Now I want to trim down this edge specifically on the same edge where I made the 3-inch mark. I want to trim that down to 17 3/4 of an inch everywhere except this portion right here. This portion, this 3-inch portion that I marked off, I want to leave that at 18 inches wide. Everything else, I'm trimming down to 17 3/4 of an inch. Mark off 17 3/4. I just do that all along. Take my ruler, line it up with those marks. Now very carefully, just making sure my ruler doesn't shift, I'm going to trim off 1/4 inch right up to that mark that we made for the 3 inches. Don't go past it, and then I'm just going to cut that off right there. So you can see I've got fabric, it's almost all the way across 17 3/4 inch, and then there's just this little 1/4 inch overhang on this corner. So I've got my little 2 3/4 inch square here. I'm going to mark on 2 sides a 5/8 inch seam allowance. There you got your 2 5/8 inch seam allowances. I'm going to put it on the corner here. This is the same side as the notch, just on the opposite corner. Place it here so that the seam allowances are facing in this direction, inwards toward the fabric, not towards the edge. And then I'm just going to grab a couple clips to clip this in place. And now we're going to take it to the sewing machine. So I'm at my sewing machine and I just wanted to point out that I am using my Teflon foot. This might not be necessary for you, but because I'm using a fabric with a rubberized backing, it has a tendency to stick on both the foot and the feed dogs underneath it. I'm also going to use a little piece of tissue paper underneath the feed dogs so that it doesn't mar the rubberized backing on my fabric. So I'm just doing a straight stitch 2.5. I will suggest that if you're using a fabric like mine, thick and with a rubberized backing, you may need to adjust the tension on your thread. So I would give it a try with some test pieces and see how that is. I'm going to take my fabric here. Then I'm going to take the little piece of tissue paper and just make sure that it's underneath the stitch lines. It can be a little fiddly. Now I'm going to start sewing just on the lines that I marked. And just a tip, when ripping away the tissue paper after you've stitched a line, try to rip it sort of upwards rather than out, and that'll give you the cleanest removal of the paper. Okay, so we've attached the small square to the main body piece. Now what we want to do is cut away the interior part of this square. It doesn't need to be super precise. We just want to leave about a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the inside. So you've got your 1/4 inch with a cutout here. What you want to do is cut or clip right into this seam allowance up to the corner, but definitely do not clip through the corner, just as close as you can to the corner without clipping through. That's pretty good. Now I am going to flip this inside out. Just try to flatten that seam. Just sort of press with your finger that corner. If you have fabric that will accept an iron, you can iron this and that will give the nicest finish. For me, I'm just going to press this hard, give it a really good finger press. Try to get this as flat as possible. Little puckering right here is possible. There probably will be a little bit, but that's all right. All right. You can see this is the outside and this is the inside. Now I want to fold this raw edge inwards over the seam allowance, like that, and just fold it over. See, it covers seam allowance, and then I'm going to take a clip, clip that down. Another one and clip it down. Great. And I'll do that on this edge as well. Put it over the seam allowance. Fold it over. There you go. Clip on that. It's a little fiddly here. This is probably the most fiddly part. There you go. So I just want to do an edge stitch all along this corner here. I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm leaving my Teflon foot on, even though I don't need it. But I will need it for future stitching. Lift it up, and I just want to make sure as best as I'm able that I'm getting that little corner tucked in there. You can use a scissor or a seam ripper or you have a little stiletto, that'd be great as well. All right. And there you have it. You can see that we have our cutout notch and on the inside. So now we're going to take the main body of our fabric and just fold it in half, wrong sides together, so right sides facing out, and make sure that the edges are all matching. If you have a good center crease here, you shouldn't need to pin. And now we're just going to take it over the machine and we're going to sew the side seams. All right, so just line it up, 5/8 inch straight seam. Okay, so I've reached where my notch is, and I still want to maintain a 5/8 inch seam from this edge, not from this edge. Because this is a 1/4 inch, it should be just shy of an inch total. So I'm just going to eyeball it and just try to maintain a straight seam from this edge, not from this edge. And now we're just sewing the other side, and it's just a straight 5/8 inch seam. Nothing special about it. So we have both of the seams done. Now we have to box the corners before we finish the seams. Each corner needs to be boxed 2 inches by 1.5 inches. So I actually want a 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch square, but I want it to go from the center crease to this stitch line, not to the edge. So I'm going to measure a 1.5 by 1.5 inch square, but it's going to be measured from this stitch line and from the center. And I'm lining up 1.5 inches with this bottom, so the center crease here. And then I'm lining up 1.5 inches with this side seam here, not with the edge. Just cut that. And do that on the other side. Now we have our boxed corners. Before we stitch the corners together, I'm going to finish these side seams. So I'm doing a faux flat felled seam. So I am going to finger press these seams open. And then I'm going to trim this seam allowance. So this is the side. This is the half of the panel that has the notch here. On that side, I'm going to trim this seam allowance to, I would say, a scant 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be precise. Make sure you're not cutting through both sides of the seam allowance, just this half of the seam allowance. All right, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to finger press it open, and then I'm going to trim down just half the seam allowance. Now that we've got our trimmed seam allowance, open this back up. And I want to take the seam allowance here, the longer seam allowance, fold it over, just fold it right over that shorter seam allowance. Like so. So we're folding it over, and then we're folding it towards the back side of the cover. That conceals the seam allowance on both sides in there. So I'm going to do that along the whole edge. And I'm just finger pressing it. If you want to measure and be very precise about it, you can, but I'm just eyeballing it to make sure that it looks relatively even in thickness. So now I am going to just pin it a few times. Take my pin, push it through all of those layers. Little tip, but it does help to kind of, as you're doing this, pull the two sides apart at the seam to make sure that the seam is laying really flat. There you go. You can see the seam allowance is all pinned. I'm just going to do that on the other side and then take it over the machine, and we're going to do an edge stitch right here for our faux flat felled seam. So I'm pinning this side now with the notch. And as you can see, when you get here, you have a bit of extra fabric. So I want to cut off this little extra notch of fabric just here. I'm going to grab my chalk and make a mark just so I know. So here's the edge of the fabric here. I just want to make a mark right where that edge is. Gonna snip in here. And then just snip away that extra fabric so that this line is flush with the edge of that notch. And I'll show you how to pin this. Okay, so we're just going to continue as we were doing before, folding under and over and pinning. Now we're here. So as you can see, we're not folding this over any seam allowance, which is why we need that extra little notch here. Because we're going to start by folding this just until it's flush with this edge. So fold this here. You can see that it's flush with that edge here. Just finger press that. It's a little fiddly. And now we're going to fold all of this together, basically pretending as if there's a seam there, even though there's not. That looks pretty good. So just pin this in place. This might be a little tricky here when you're at the machine. We'll just finger press that hard and make sure that nothing's coming up. But if you look underneath, you can see that the seam allowance is folded under twice, which seals that seam allowance as well as this seam allowance all in one go. All right, now we're going to take this over to the machine and we're going to sew down these sides to seal all the seams. So I've got my piece over to the machine and I'm going to sew down this edge just using an edge stitch. Again, I'm eyeballing it. I am starting with this part here that is near the notch. It's the trickiest part, so just go very slow. Make sure that your seam allowances are staying tucked under while you're sewing. All right, and here is the flat felled seam, or the faux flat felled seam, and now I'm just going to do the exact same thing on the other side. So now that we have our faux flat felled seams on the sides completed, we're going to do the boxed corners. So open up your boxed corners and put the two flat edges together like so, and then I'm going to take this to the machine and just do a straight stitch across on both boxed corners. I didn't mention this earlier, but just before I stitch, I want to note that you have the right sides out, the wrong sides together, and that is how we're doing the initial stitch, and we are doing a 1/4 inch seam on the top here. There you go, you got your 1/4 inch, and I'm just going to do that on the other side now. Okay, So we have our corners boxed with a 1/4 inch seam here. Now I'm going to turn it inside out. Press out the corners of your boxed corner. If you have a pencil or something, that'd be good. And then just press the seam flat like that. So we're going to finish these using a French seam. So now I'm just going to take this to the machine and I'm going to sew down the boxed corner at 3/8 of an inch, just a flat seam like that, and that will seal the seam allowance in there. And I just want to mention that I am again using some tissue paper since the interior, which is sticky, is facing the feed dogs. So just place that underneath and put it in the sewing machine. And I am doing a 3/8 inch seam allowance. All right, so we have our completed boxed corners with the French seams. Now I am just going to hem the bottom before putting on the Velcro and we will be completely done. I am going to change the stitch length all the way to 4. And you can see here I am going to sew just basting stitches a 1/4 inch from the edge. And I'm going to do that all the way around the bottom. I'm just sewing through a single layer of fabric. So as you can see, we now have our 1/4 inch from the edge basting stitches. And what we're going to do is just use this as a guide to fold up the fabric, just so that you can see the basting stitches, and then fold it one more time. We'll have a nice even 1/4 inch-ish hem. And if you want, you can press this, but I'm just going to clip this all around. Got our doubled over hem, and I'm just going to go ahead and sew it. So the hem is done and pretty much the entire cover is done. The last step is an optional step, and that's just to add a little bit of Velcro here, and that will help hold the cover on over the propane hose, which is what this little notch is for. So I'm going to go ahead and sew that on. If you have stick-on Velcro, you can also use that. I just happen to have the sew-on Velcro. So I'm going to take, you can just estimate it, maybe like a 1 inch piece of Velcro, and I'm going to sew that right onto here. Just cut my little 1 inch piece of Velcro, and this is the sort of bristly side, not the soft side. Take that and I am going to just sew it right here. I'm not going to sew over the seam allowances because that's a little too bulky for my machine. I'm just going to sew onto the single layer of fabric. All right, I am just eyeballing this and I'm just trying to get an edge stitch as close as possible to the edge of the Velcro, and I do have a bit of tissue paper underneath. And I'm just sewing a rectangle all around the Velcro, and I'm going to do that twice just to secure the Velcro, since it will, you know, experience a lot of force, a lot of pulling force when you attach it and detach it. Not the most absolutely beautiful job, but it will hold the Velcro on there. That's what we're going for. So now I'm just going to go and measure out a piece of the other Velcro and attach to the other side. Okay, so I have this piece of Velcro attached, and it's the prickly one, and so now I'm going to measure out and attach this soft Velcro to the other side. So I'll just start by pressing it onto this other piece of Velcro, attaching that. Measure out how much we need. So in this case, I want it to be an inch past this seam line here, this little stitch line right here. Just roughly. I am estimating this. It's not crucial. Just trimming that. All right. Okay, so I'm going to take it over to the machine, and I'm just going to stitch again a rectangle, not going through the seam allowances or the hem, just to hold that on there. And then we will be done. There you have it, attached Velcro, and that'll hold it on. And here is the moment of truth. You just slip the cover over your Wave 3 heater. It goes over the knob and the piezo starter. And then you just take the Velcro and run it underneath the propane hose and attach it to the other side, and that will safely and securely keep the cover on the Wave 3 heater. I thought this was a really fun little project with a lot of options for fabric customization, and it turned out to be quite a bit cheaper than the Wave 3 covers that you can purchase online. I hope that you all enjoyed this video, and if you do make this cover for your own Wave 3 heater, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.